September 8th, 1987, Atlanta, Georgia. The ideas for horror movies often come from the inner workings of our own imaginations and our own fears. What separates everyday life from these horror movies is that those that are fake and created merely for entertainment. But what if I told you that there was a very real life case of an incident so mysterious and so bizarre, we are still left with very little answers today? On a quiet night in Atlanta, a couple in a house on 1114 Fountain Drive would have one of the strangest days anyone could ever have, and perhaps encounter something straight out of a horror movie. This house would start bleeding from the walls, the ceiling, and the floors. And if on the surface this wouldn't seem odd enough, this blood was human blood. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we look at a fascinating enigma from the late 1980s that blurs what we do and don't understand. Today, we search for answers in the case of the Atlanta Blood House. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today's episode is one that I had previously heard about before, and it was actually a listener suggestion as well, and this one just happened to go in my queue, and I got a little inspiration to do it for this week for an episode. Now, my prior knowledge to researching this topic in depth was pretty vague, in the idea that I only knew bits and pieces, but what I did know before researching was kind of how confusing and mysterious that this whole thing was from start to finish. And what might be the most mysterious of all is that we still don't have any answers to this day about what happened that night in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, before we dive into the events that took place that fateful night in Atlanta, I'm going to give you a quick rundown about how this episode is going to go. Firstly, I'm going to go into the details about what happened that night and the subsequent investigation into the house, perhaps go into a similar but very different case about an object seeming to bleed with no explanation, and then we can dive into some common theories and thoughts about what could be possibly at play here. And then at the very end, we will wrap it all up. But with that being said, let's get into the story. Now, our story begins on September 8th, 1987, at 1114 Fountain Drive. 1114 Fountain Drive was a large 6-bedroom brick house, and it was the home of William and Minnie Winston, who were 79 and 77 at the time. Now, obviously, they were both elderly, and at the time they had already raised 3 children together. Albeit, from what I could find, they weren't super close with their children. Now, William, who went by Willie, was not in good health at all during this time. He was on dialysis and spent much of his time in bed. He was very frail. And because of that, Minnie, in a lot of ways, was a full-time caretaker to him, as he couldn't do many day-to-day activities without some sort of help. Now, on that night, around 11:30 p.m., Minnie had already locked up the house for the night, and the alarm had already been set, and she decided to take a bath and unwind for the evening before heading off to bed. When Minnie stepped out of the bath, she noticed quite a strange sight. There were little spots of a red liquid on the bathroom floor. Minnie was perplexed and also concerned. On closer inspection, these small droplets and puddles looked to be blood. Minnie panicked, thinking that possibly Willie had been hurt and that he had hurt himself in some way and that he was bleeding around the house. Now, when Minnie left the bathroom to try and find Willie is when she would be greeted by the sight of more blood. But not just spots of it on the floor, but rather everywhere. It was along the baseboards, coming down the walls, oozing out from underneath appliances, and even a geyser of blood that shot out from the floor. Crazy, right? Now, more blood was even found in crawl spaces underneath the home that were discovered after further investigation. When Minnie found Willie, who was still in bed and was asleep at the time, he was clearly not hurt, and she shook him awake to tell him about what was going on inside of the house. When Willie awoke, and by the time the two of them had made it out into the hallway, a lot of the blood coming down the walls had settled on the floor in large stagnant pools. Now, in the 22 years the couple had been renting the house, nothing like this had ever happened before, and it was quite hard to put into words about what was occurring and what occurred. Now, shortly after all of this happened, the Winstons called 911, with that seemingly being their only option to try and unravel the mystery of what just unfolded. Now, when the call came into the Atlanta Police Department, it broke up at the time a staff birthday party that was going on that night, and the first officer to pick up the phone, from what I could find, got a phone call from the fire department saying that an elderly couple had called and gotten in touch with them, telling them about the blood and what occurred. The detective who picked up the phone was quoted as saying, "Blood coming down the walls? But there is no body?" Close quote. After the detective got off the phone, he spoke to the other detectives in the office and said, and I quote, "An elderly couple called the fire department. She says there's blood everywhere, but no sign of a body." Close quote. Shortly after the call to the emergency services, all sorts of police cars, fire trucks, and EMTs dotted the street. The EMT's main goal was to see if Minnie or Willie was hurt in any way, and of course they weren't. They also checked to see if somehow there was a leak from Willie's dialysis machine, thinking that would be the initial culprit. They went and checked on that dialysis machine, and there was no leak from it. Now, while the police were getting on the scene, so did the house's landlord show up as well, and they started looking around for any sorts of clues as to where the blood could have come from. They started looking underneath appliances, and they started looking for any burst pipes underneath the house at all. Now, while doing this, they also even found bloodstains underneath the TV set in the basement, which seems very random, and this kind of led them to an even greater head scratcher on what the hell even happened. Because after all, houses can't bleed, right? Because that's exactly what Atlanta Police Department Detective Steve Cartwright had thought. There was no way this house bled, and that it really doesn't make any sense. Detective Cartwright asked Minnie how she felt her eyesight was, to which she responded with, "It's fine, and I know what I saw." Now, even though the police officers saw the blood at the time, they thought this could either be paint or rust, as they had no reason to believe or even suspect that this could actually be blood. And on the surface, I can understand that. However, a lab tech who responded to the scene at the Winston home thought the whole story wasn't adding up. She consulted with Detective Cartwright, who confirmed that, albeit while it did look like blood, he didn't think it was. Now, the lab tech, whose name was Brenda, she proceeded to go around the house taking pictures of the blood splatter in multiple different locations and collecting samples to try and test back at the lab. Now, when Brenda ran these tests on the samples to see if they were human blood, they came quickly, and the results were very surprising. The tests did in fact confirm that it was blood in the Winston household, but not just any blood, type O blood. Now, if you have no idea about type O blood is an extremely valuable resource because it is able to be universally used amongst everyone who needs a blood transfusion of any type. However, what makes this case more strange is that neither Minnie or Willie had type O blood. They were both type A, which kind of added some more, I would say, intrigue to the mystery, and it got everybody's brains thinking even a little bit more, even if they already weren't at this point. Now, on September 10th, 1987, 2 days after the events at the Winston home, the Atlanta Police Department would have a press conference that would recap all of the findings of their investigation. During this press conference, they make the announcement of the quote-unquote copious blood that was found inside the residence, and to summarize, the whole thing was extremely mysterious in that no one within the police department had really seen anything like this, and initially they did have a couple theories. Now, I will save the majority of the possible theories until the very end, but the blood in the Winston home led some people to an interesting conclusion. There was no body to be found, so it couldn't have been that there was a crime that had possibly taken place on the property, and when diving into the theory that perhaps someone had stolen or got blood from a blood bank and placed it all over the house, this too didn't make any sense. During this time period in the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic was in its heyday. Blood was an essential resource for people who had gotten the disease, and the fact that this blood was type O would make that an incredible waste of that resource. However, to procure this blood, it wouldn't have been an easy feat, because someone would have to steal it from a secure location like a blood bank, which in the 1980s because of that increased demand of blood because of the AIDS epidemic. These blood banks had pretty high in security, and they were pretty well guarded. You couldn't just walk in there, steal a bag of blood, and leave. That is not the case whatsoever. Now, to procure this blood, like I mentioned, it wouldn't have been able to be an easy feat. And with Minnie and Willie's old age, it's hard to think that this would be something that they would do. And if they did, why? What's the motivation? I find it hard-pressed to think that there would be any, but we will dive into that a little bit later in theories, although I did want to kind of add a little bit of context, and then obviously the whole blood bank theory will come up at the very end. Now, when the story of the Blood House hit the media, it spread and got a lot of people's attention, and arguably created a media circus, and people wanted to see the house that bled in person. As it took the headlines in newspapers about the bleeding house on Fountain Drive, people gathered outside the Winstons' home. They wanted to see the house firsthand. And some of these people wanted to check it out because they thought maybe it had a connection with the supernatural. Obviously, you had news reporters flocking all over the street and in front of the house to try and get a little piece of the story, and people even calling the Winstons day and night. Minnie and Willie, obviously, did not get a lot of sleep during this time. The idea that perhaps a spiritual entity was responsible for the house bleeding was a theory that was thrown around, and many people believed that this was the case, as all the other bleeds and theories dried up. A self-described parapsychologist even showed up unannounced at the Winston household with a reporter, presumably trying to see if this was the work of some sort of ghost or poltergeist, and was trying to capitalize on the media sensation of the time. Now, of course, probably like many other people who tried to gain access to the Winstons' home or even try and call Minnie and Willie, this pair was obviously turned away. The Winstons did not like this increased publicity to their home. They felt like it was an invasion of privacy, and the media had lied and spun the story in a way that got the public way too interested in the story. But on the other hand, I also found that while Minnie hated the attention, Willie didn't mind it, as in his frail state he was quoted as saying, "Me, I'm not bothered by it, because I'm in bad enough shape as it is." Close quote. Eventually, the police stopped investigating. Nothing was coming up as viable theories, and with no evidence that a crime took place, it was a monumental dead end. The police, who were originally very in touch with the case and trying to solve it, kind of distanced themselves due to disagreements with how evidence was being handled from the lab and testing being delayed and some information not being relayed from the lab to the investigators. About a month and a half later, on October 24th, Atlanta homicide detective H.L. Bolton was quoted in the newspaper with the following quote: "We have not stopped looking because we know houses don't bleed, but we haven't determined that a crime was committed, and that is our primary concern." However, it wouldn't be long after that for the case to slowly be forgotten about and pushed back on the shelf with other unsolved cases. And to this day, that is where it remains, as we truly don't have much more to, if any at all, more information or insight as to what could have happened. Later in 1987, Kurt Rowlett, a part-time musician and part-time paranormal investigator, decided to try and call the Winstons' home to try and learn more about the case. It had been some time since the case was front-page news, and he was curious if Minnie and Willie wanted to speak with him. When he called the Winston home, Minnie picked up the phone and agreed to actually speak with him. Now, when Kurt sat down with them, Minnie gave a much different account of the events of that day. She said that it wasn't blood coming down their walls, but rather a mixture of rust and mud. On the surface, you might be thinking, oh, well, there it is. She just admitted this whole thing was a hoax. But before you jump to that conclusion, not so fast. We know the house actually bled that day. That's a scientific fact, as the lab tests prove that. We have to naturally assume that the reason Minnie possibly gave this answer to Kurt was because of the media pressure, and possibly wanting to forget about this entire ordeal, and to be honest with you, that would make sense. There's only so much a person can take when it comes to endless investigations and intense media pressure for some sort of answer on the story, and everybody knocking on your door and calling your phone, and even people standing out in your front yard and, like I said, calling at all ends of the night to try and get a little bit of the story. There's only so much anybody can take of that. So I understand with her kind of trying to redirect the story a little bit. Now, before we dive right into theories, I felt like it would be important to kind of wrap up some of the talking points I mentioned, and then perhaps dive into another interesting case of another object that has the weird and mysterious ability to also bleed. Now, what we know is that the house bled pretty much everywhere. The crawl spaces, the spare bedrooms, coming out of the floor, and splattered just pretty much everywhere. We also know that it's typo blood, which would be hard to come by if this was just the two of them trying to plan some type of hoax. We also know that they didn't fully get along with their children, to which I couldn't really find nothing about, but I'll kind of go deeper into their kids a little later in theories, because they do come up as a possible theory. We also know the house was locked and alarmed, meaning that there was no possible way somebody stumbled into the house who was hurt and bleeding all over the place. Since Minnie and Willie were not hurt and no one else was in the house, we arrive at a dead end. However, the house bleeding on Fountain Drive isn't the first case of an item that has mysteriously had the ability to bleed. And the idea of objects bleeding is not a common phenomenon, and for good reasons, obviously. Perhaps the most infamous case of an inanimate object that seemed to bleed comes from the stories of weeping statues from all over the world. Now, if you know anything about the weeping statue phenomenon, it's kind of covered with very delicate attention in mind. Most of the weeping statues happen within Catholic churches across the world, and the church usually wants to make sure that they treat these things with caution. Now, one of the more infamous cases of the weeping statues phenomenon does involve one of these statues appearing to weep blood. The statue of Saint Padre Pio in Sicily was witnessed to have been crying tears of blood all the way back in 2002. However, unfortunately, when the blood that was on the statue from the tears was tested, it actually came back to a woman, and that it was closed as a hoax. That makes me kind of wonder, did somebody, deliberately cut themselves, or did they get somebody's blood to use and plant on the statue? Like, why would somebody do this? And to that answer, I personally have no idea. Maybe publicity reasons? Maybe to bring some additional awareness to the church, and maybe this could have been used as some sort of recruitment campaign to attract more people to the Catholic Church, but I'm not sure. However, other cases of weeping statues, and other statues, for that matter, have seemed to cry blood. However, these have also been confirmed to be hoaxes, and the blood of these other cases came back to other different individuals, people who planted the blood on the statues. Now, this obviously implies that the statues were never really actually bleeding. Now, from what else I could find after a brief search over the internet is that inanimate objects don't bleed, and quite frankly, I couldn't find anything else about this happening, making what happened on 1114 Fountain Drive truly a one-off type of event. Now, the idea of this being some sort of paranormal event, as we've kind of mentioned in brief spurts over the course of this episode, has kind of split opinions on the internet. Now, with one article I read claiming that since we don't have any other clear answers or theories, a paranormal spirit could be to blame. Now, paranormal spirits, and ghosts for that matter, are very valid, and they're very valid theories in a lot of cases that seem to not have any explanation. And we have seen very disturbing cases that revolve around the paranormal and poltergeist-like activity. We don't know the history of that house, or at least not from what I could find anyways, and the Winstons did say that they had not been experiencing anything haunted or strange or any behavior that you might consider ghost-like inside the house. But could this be a cover of some sort? Maybe they were experiencing something strange, however, and they didn't know how to tell people, and with Willie being frail and in bad condition, they were sort of left with very little options in terms of finding places to stay if they wanted to try and move out. Maybe there was some sort of haunting, and it culminated into this event. But with that being said, let's kind of take a second and dive into some of the other theories that I do have. Now, our first theory is the one I just mentioned, and that being a paranormal incident. Like I just mentioned, the paranormal could fit the bill in some ways. However, like I previously mentioned, this story resides on the fact that there were other things going on in the house that the Winstons did not want to talk about. Even though they said they didn't have any hauntings of any other sort, do we know that for a fact? We really don't. Like I previously stated, could they have just maybe sucked up the behavior from the spirits in order to continue to stay at the home with Willie's condition worsening? Maybe. However, evidence doesn't fully point us in that direction, and even though the public thought this was a paranormal event, again, there's not really any evidence that points us in that direction either. After all, 5 years prior to when the house bled in Atlanta, the first Poltergeist movie was released, and it was 1982. That was when the first movie was released, and that movie was a big deal. If you know anything about, the release of the very first Poltergeist movie, or anything about, those very early horror movies and ghost movies from the 80s and 90s and stuff like that, when Poltergeist released, that was a big deal. I mean, even when The Exorcism released as well, huge deal as well. So, the people who kind of saw this movie, it was terrifying, but also sparked public interest in the paranormal. Now, could that be possibly what's happening here? The public got all stirred up, and maybe that's what pushed them to the paranormal theory? Possibly, and I like to think that that's probably what got them all kind of worked up. Maybe outside influence, and also with the idea that there wasn't any other valid theories to begin with. Now, even with these facts, I'm pretty hard-pressed to believe that this is a paranormal event of any sort. Now, the second theory I have is called help from their daughter. Now, this theory proposes the idea that the Winston's daughter, who was a nurse at the time this happened, possibly procured the blood for Minnie and Willie to possibly use as a hoax, and to possibly use this blood to move out from the house and from renting. Now, this could be maybe because they couldn't afford rent anymore, and kind of didn't know how to tell the landlord, or maybe they were even behind on payments and needed a way out. And they just didn't know how to just break the news. Hey, we're all out of money. We've spent all this money, caring for Willie. He's on dialysis. We spent all this money caring for him. We're going to eventually run out of money. We got to try and find a way where we can get out of the house and try and skip out on our payments. Do we know that? We don't know that. Or at least I couldn't find that anywhere. Now, possibly they did try to frame this as an instance where they would endure this kind of traumatic experience, and it would kind of be framed as this idea like, okay, they endured this thing, and maybe the landlords out of pity would let them leave. Again, I don't know. This is all my opinion. I'm just brainstorming. I'm just speculating. Don't come after my head for me just kind of throwing this information out there. However, this is kind of an interesting theory. However, like I said, this is all hearsay because there is no evidence to support this. We don't have any evidence that says that the daughter procured the blood from the hospital or a blood bank or wherever she was working at the time. We just don't know that. This is all speculation. Now, this third theory, is also about the daughter, and this being a frame job from their daughter, or perhaps their other children as well. Now, this is the complete opposite from the last theory I just mentioned, and that being perhaps their daughter, who worked in a hospital, who was a nurse, had access to blood, and then perhaps she used that blood to maybe get her parents to sell the house, or kind of bail out on rent, and possibly make it seem like her parents were going crazy, and could get somebody to declare her parents, Willie and Minnie, as mentally unfit, and claim many of their assets. Now, this is an interesting theory, and it is one that is thrown around quite a bit. However, after listening to some other podcasts that talked about this event, most notably being Theories of the Third Kind and Red Web, which I believe I've mentioned both of those before. If you've not taken a listen to either of them, they're great shows. Definitely suggest that you check them out. However, on the Red Web podcast that covered this, they did say that this theory seemed to be more based in, not in fact, but rather rumors. And that this was something the public latched onto as a theory because there was nothing to go off of, obviously. There was a lack of evidence. And this wasn't anything more than that the relationship the Winstons had with their children actually wasn't that bad. And like I said, it was something that the media latched onto and was like, oh, they have a bad relation with their kids. Maybe their daughter, who's a nurse, maybe she got the blood and she put it all in their house. That was more or less a story created by the media. But it wasn't really the reality of the situation. Now, I can kind of believe this theory that maybe her daughter or maybe the other children that Minnie and Willie had could probably try and frame their parents as mentally unfit and try and claim some of their assets. That could be it. However, again, there's no evidence to support this. A lot of these theories just have no evidence to support it. And again, I feel like I'm always back at square one in terms of discussing theories and so on and so forth. Now, my last theory is landlords. And this theory revolves around the idea that perhaps the landlords had something to do with it. Again, this is all speculation, and this is me just throwing ideas out there. But maybe perhaps Minnie and Willie had some sort of falling out with the landlords. Or perhaps maybe they wanted them out of there for unrelated reasons. Maybe the Winstons ran out of funds and they couldn't pay rent, but however, given Willie's condition, that left the landlords with very few options in terms of getting the Winstons to leave the house. It would make sense that the landlords would have access to the house, as they are, of course, both the landlords, and it would also be reasonable to assume that they would be able to disarm the alarm, have a key to the building, and would be able to basically get into the house after they locked it up. Maybe the landlords planted the blood and then made it look like some crazy phenomenon to get the couple to leave. It's all just a theory. But other than this one, the other three kind of don't really answer my questions, or the questions that I do have, where this one kind of makes some sense. If in reality the Winstons were, they've been renting for 22 years, obviously, once medical bills start to rack up, obviously it is not cheap, so maybe they were running out of money and they just kind of, again, Willie's not in good health, couldn't really get to a point where they felt like they could evict him. Maybe they're like, oh, let's try and make it look like there's some sort of crazy thing that happened, and maybe then they'll leave. That's kind of an interesting theory. I mean, I'd be curious to see how that would work out and if this was actually what happened, because obviously the Winstons didn't move out of the house shortly after that happened, so clearly if this was the case, it didn't fully work. However, let's get into my own personal thoughts on this. Now, this whole case is really just weird from start to finish. And I think an interesting part of this case is when I started looking into other sources. And on the Red Web podcast that I briefly mentioned before, they made note in their research that the accounts of the amount of blood could have been exaggerated by news outlets, and that the amount of blood in the home is not as much as it's made to believe. I mean, obviously, any amount of blood in your home is too much. I feel like that's just a blanket statement. However, I think maybe it wasn't gushing or oozing like described by the media or described by, a lot of sources that tell the story. However, I'm just unsure. This whole thing is weird, and to be honest with you, I don't really have any clue as to what happened here. And perhaps that's part of the mystery and intrigue of it all. My personal theory on what I think happened is that either this was some sort of hoax to maybe try and get some type of attention, or maybe perhaps a frame job by the landlords to try and get them to move out. Sounds like a reasonable explanation. Those kind of seem to make sense in my eyes, but I think you could really go with any theory and just brainstorming and throwing ideas out. I think you could provide a semi-strong case as to why you think that is the theory and what you think is responsible. However, you're kind of always back to square one because there really is no evidence. And that's kind of why, all of these years later, 30 years later, we still don't have any answers as to what happened because there's no evidence. There's nothing to point us in a certain direction or a certain theory. But with that being said, that's going to kind of conclude this episode on the Atlanta Bloodhouse. I hope I summarized it all up there good enough for you. Obviously, a little bit of a shorter episode, I think, for this week, only because there is such a lack of evidence, and it was a listener suggestion. I try to get to those sooner rather than later, so it seems like I am doing them, I am writing them down, I am keeping track, just so you all who are listening to my content and supporting me, I'm showing you that I do listener suggestions, and I take them seriously, and I do all this research, and I just wanted to show to you all that I do these, and I try and get to them at a timely manner, and I try to dig up as much as I can with the limited amount of time I have over the course of a week to do all this research. So, other than that, I appreciate you turning in to this week's episode. If you are listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you were listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend, family member, coworker, doesn't matter. If they are interested in something like this and you think this might be the podcast for them, send that out to them. Share it out to them. I greatly appreciate it. You're kind of expanding my network out there. Again, I appreciate it. It goes without words, me saying thank you in regards to that. Also, feel free to go ahead and follow my Instagram. That is Unblurring the Unknown on Instagram. I'll be posting the custom cover art for this week's episode on Instagram, so feel free to check that out. And as I mentioned before, this topic was a listener suggestion, so feel free to send listener topic suggestions to me. You can send those to my email, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com, or you can message me on Instagram as well. That is also a viable topic suggestion point as well. But with that being said, this is going to conclude this week's episode. And before I leave you, I want to leave you with a little tidbit going into next week. Now, to any of you who follow me on Instagram, I did do a poll on my Instagram for what you all wanted to see for next week's episode. Now, the winner of that topic suggestion, I gave you 3 choices between Internet Mystery, a paranormal episode, or an episode over some type of cryptid. Now, the winner was Internet Mystery, followed very closely, tight second, to the paranormal. So next week's episode is going to be an Internet Mystery, followed by the week after I'm going to do paranormal, just to kind of appease all you folks that like the paranormal stuff. I am going to do that after I do the Internet Mystery, since that one did win. And I'm really looking forward to that episode. Still doing research on it now. There's a lot of information that I got to dig up, and I'm really excited for it. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode over the Atlanta Blood House. Again, hope you all enjoyed it, and I will catch you all on the next one.